The house stood at the edge of a quiet street in New York, its pale brick walls and towering windows a sharp contrast to the bustle of the city beyond. For Sarah, it was supposed to be the beginning of something beautiful, a new chapter, a fresh start. She and Thomas had dreamed of this moment, talked about it endlessly, and finally they had found it. A home. But now, in the stillness of this new house, Sarah could feel something she hadn't anticipated, a quiet unease settling into her bones. It wasn't a thing you could touch or see, but it lingered in the corners of the house like a soft, invisible weight. And as the days passed, Sarah began to wonder, had she made a mistake? Pregnancy had its own way of changing everything. She'd never imagined how much of her time would be spent alone, waiting for Thomas to return after long hours at the office, sometimes gone for days at a stretch. She tried to make herself busy, arranging the rooms, planning for the baby. But there were moments, in the quiet stretches of the day, when the house felt too big, too empty, like it was never meant for just one person. Sarah often found herself sitting at the window, gazing out at the city below, watching life pass by while she was stuck inside, in this place that didn't yet feel like home. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next as she moved from room to room, the house echoing her footsteps in a way that felt unnatural. Sometimes she swore she could hear something, a sound just beyond the edge of her hearing, a whisper that slipped away whenever she tried to focus on it. But she dismissed it, chalking it up to the pregnancy, to the isolation. It wasn't until the small things started happening that Sarah began to wonder if there was something more to it. The objects, the way they moved when she wasn't looking. A cup left by the sink that wasn't there when she came back. The front door that creaked open in the middle of the night as if someone had just walked in. Sarah couldn't explain it, but the feeling, the sense that she wasn't alone, grew. The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed, the covers pulled tightly around her, she would feel the room shift, the air turn cold, as though someone else was there with her, watching her sleep. She would wake to find the blanket gone, her limbs chilled by the cool air. The first time it happened, she told herself it was just a bad dream. But it kept happening, night after night, and slowly, Sarah began to realize that this house, this new life she had dreamed of, was not the safe haven she had imagined. There was something about this house, something in the walls, in the floors beneath her feet, that seemed to be waiting for her to notice, waiting for her to acknowledge it. In the silence of the day, in the stillness of the night, Sarah began to feel the presence, unseen, but undeniably real. She didn't know if it was her mind playing tricks on her, or if the house itself was alive in some strange, unexplainable way. But one thing was certain: she was no longer alone. It had been 5 months since Sarah and Thomas first stepped foot in the house on the quiet New York street. 5 months since they had walked through the front door, eyes wide with excitement and anticipation, and felt the weight of a fresh beginning. Back then, the house had been everything they had dreamed of, bright, spacious and full of promise. The long hallways, the high ceilings, the large windows that let in so much light. It was a perfect fit for their new life, or so they thought. They had spent weeks talking about it, browsing listings, visiting open houses, and imagining what it would be like to finally settle down. They had lived in cramped apartments before, each one smaller than the last, each one feeling like a temporary stop in their journey. But this house was different. It was theirs. They could picture it, the nursery for the baby they had been planning for, a cozy living room for nights spent watching movies, a big kitchen for Sarah to try new recipes in. Everything about it felt right. Sarah had been eager to start this new chapter, but the reality of their move had set in quickly. The house, while beautiful, was far more isolated than she had expected. Nestled on a quiet street, away from the pulse of the city, it was peaceful, maybe too peaceful. Thomas, ever the hard-working man, had been thrown into his new job almost immediately. The days began to stretch out before Sarah, long and solitary. At first, she found comfort in the silence. She spent her days unpacking, cleaning, organizing. But as the weeks passed, she began to notice how the silence weighed on her. She would walk through the house, trying to fill the emptiness with her movements, but it always felt like something was missing, something just out of reach. 5 months later, Sarah found herself standing by the window in the living room, her growing belly pressing against the windowsill as she watched the city bustle below. It felt like the world outside was still spinning, full of life and motion, while inside her house, everything was still. Her husband Thomas had left that morning for another long day at work, another long stretch of hours without him. She had become accustomed to this by now, his absence, the long hours he spent at the office, the days he would go without coming home. He promised it was all for their future, that this new job was a necessary step in their lives. And Sarah wanted to believe him. She did believe him. But sometimes, in the silence of the house, she couldn't help but wonder if it was all worth it. She wasn't used to being alone like this. Sure, she had spent time on her own before, but it had always been in small doses, an afternoon here or there, a quiet evening when Thomas worked late. But now she had entire days to fill by herself, alone with her thoughts, alone in this large, empty house. At first, the emptiness had been comforting. The house was hers to fill however she pleased. It was her chance to finally create the life she had always dreamed of, a life that wasn't cramped or confined by the walls of a small apartment. But as the days wore on, the silence became oppressive. It pressed against her in ways she couldn't explain. She began to feel like she was being watched, though there was no one around. When she was home alone, she swore she could hear footsteps in the hallway, faint and distant, as if someone was walking just out of sight. She would stop and listen, but there was nothing. Just silence. At first, she dismissed it. It was the house settling, she told herself. The creaks and groans of a building trying to adjust to its new occupants. Nothing more. But then, the little things started to happen. Small, almost imperceptible changes that made Sarah feel uneasy. One day, she found her keys on the kitchen counter, though she was certain she had left them on the entryway table. Another time, she noticed the living room chair had been moved slightly, just enough to make her pause. Thomas must have done it, she told herself. But deep down, something didn't feel right. It was as if the house itself was shifting, moving in ways she couldn't understand. One evening, after Thomas had gone to bed, Sarah was sitting on the couch, watching TV. The light from the screen flickered in the dark room, casting long shadows against the walls. The quiet of the house seemed to amplify every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and then, just as she settled back into the cushions, she heard it. A soft creak, the sound of a door opening. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly, looking toward the hallway, but there was nothing there. The house was empty. She shook her head, telling herself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had moved the door, or maybe she had imagined it. But the unease lingered. She turned the volume on the TV up louder, trying to drown out the sound of her thoughts, but it didn't help. The silence returned, but it felt different now, thicker. It felt like it was holding something back, waiting. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. The disoriented feeling would rise up like a wave, crashing into her when she least expected it. She would be in the kitchen chopping vegetables and suddenly feel a cold draft that had no obvious source. Or she would be sitting at her desk, reading, and catch a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of her eye. Something that wasn't there when she looked directly. Once she found the door to the basement open, when she was certain she had closed it earlier that day. But there was no one in the house but her. Every time something odd happened, she told herself it was nothing. A mistake, a draft, a trick of the light. But each time, the feeling of unease deepened, and she couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Sarah had always been logical, grounded. She didn't believe in ghosts or things that went bump in the night. But there was something in the house, something she couldn't explain, and it was getting harder to ignore. The days were blending together now. The long stretches of solitude in the house had become routine for Sarah, but not in the way she had imagined. There were moments when she found solace in the quiet, the space to breathe, but more often than not, the stillness felt oppressive, as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for her to acknowledge something. Thomas had been working late again. It was becoming a pattern. Long hours at the office, endless meetings, and a constant stream of texts that read, "I'll be home late, babe. Don't wait up." Sometimes he was gone for a day or two. His absence was beginning to feel permanent. It wasn't his fault, of course. He was doing this for them, for their future. She had to remind herself of that, when the loneliness crept in like a shadow. But it was harder to ignore the shadows now, the strange happenings that seemed to linger in the corners of the house. The unease Sarah had felt at the beginning was turning into something more tangible, something she couldn't shake off. She was standing in the kitchen one morning, stirring coffee, her back to the living room, when she glanced toward the hallway. For a brief moment she thought she saw something move at the end of the corridor, a shadow darting behind the door. It was gone in an instant. Sarah blinked, turned back to the counter, and shook her head. Her mind was playing tricks on her. "I need to stop letting my imagination run wild," she told herself. She couldn't afford to be paranoid, not now, not when everything was going so well. But the doubt lingered, like a gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach. That evening, as she sat down to dinner, she noticed something odd. Her phone, which she had left on the kitchen table while she was cooking, was now sitting on the living room couch. She knew she hadn't moved it, and there was no reason anyone else could have. The house was still as silent as it had always been. A chill crept up her spine. Maybe Thomas had come home and moved it, though he hadn't mentioned it. But why would he? She had been sitting at the table when she left it there. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the phone. She tapped the screen, waiting for it to unlock. Nothing, she thought. But the phone buzzed in her hand. A new notification. Another text from Thomas. "Still here. Another late one tonight. Call you when I can." Sarah sighed. She put the phone back down on the couch and returned to her meal, though the unease didn't leave her. She couldn't explain the feeling, but it was there, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. Every time she turned around, every time she left a room, the sense that something was not quite right seemed to follow her. Later that night, after dinner, she retreated to the living room and curled up on the couch with a blanket, trying to settle in for some relaxation. The television flickered to life as she picked up the remote, and soon her eyes were glued to the screen, half watching, half drifting in and out of thoughts. The house was quiet, too quiet. She could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the other room, and the occasional rustle of the leaves outside the window. The air felt thick, as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting. She shifted uneasily under the blanket, and for a brief moment she felt as though someone was standing just behind her, close enough that she could feel their presence without even looking. "Stop it," Sarah thought, trying to shake off the feeling. "You're just tired. It's nothing." But as she leaned back into the couch cushions, she heard something. A sound. Soft at first, like a faint rustle, then a whisper. It was barely audible at first, an indistinct murmur that made her freeze. She looked over her shoulder instinctively, expecting to find Thomas standing there, a tired smile on his face, telling her it was time to go to bed. But no one was there. Her heart pounded in her chest. She turned back to the TV, trying to convince herself it was just the noise from the show. But the whisper came again, this time clearer, but still not distinct enough to understand. Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up straighter, her eyes darting around the room. The walls seemed to close in a little tighter, the shadows in the corners deepening. The room felt colder, even though the thermostat was set to a comfortable temperature. It's nothing, she thought. It's just the house settling, it's just... But it didn't feel like that. It felt wrong, as though something were reaching out, brushing against her thoughts, testing her. Sarah. The whisper was unmistakable now, as if it was right behind her, so close she could feel the breath on her skin. Her spine stiffened, and she whipped around, her eyes wide and searching the room. There was no one there. Her heart was pounding now. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a draft. Maybe it was the pipes settling in the walls. But none of those explanations made sense. None of them could explain the unmistakable feeling of being watched, of being listened to. Her mind raced. You're just overtired. It's nothing. It's the isolation. That's all it is. She stood up quickly, her hands trembling as she grabbed the remote and turned off the TV. The room fell into total silence, and Sarah stood there in the dark, listening, waiting. But nothing. Her thoughts swirled in her mind, caught between disbelief and dread. She didn't want to be afraid of her own home. It was her sanctuary, her new beginning. It was supposed to be a place of comfort and safety. But with each passing day, with each oddity, Sarah's sense of security was starting to fray. She couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. She wasn't alone. The house was full of things that didn't belong, of whispers that didn't make sense, and of shadows that stretched just a little too far. The moonlight streamed faintly through the curtains, casting delicate shadows across the room. It had been a long day, filled with the quiet rhythms of solitude, and Sarah felt herself drifting into a deep sleep. The house was still, the air warm, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the old wooden beams settling beneath her. The world outside was quiet, and inside there was only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the peaceful, rhythmic sound of her own breathing. She had learned to ignore the odd noises, the creaks, the whispers, the strange occurrences. For a while, she had told herself they were just her imagination, or maybe the house settling in the stillness of the night. But now the house felt different, more present, like it was watching her, waiting for something. Tonight, though, she was too tired to worry. The exhaustion had finally caught up with her. She had spent the entire day sorting through boxes and organizing the house, trying to make it feel like home, and she had not yet fully adjusted to the silence of the place. She had been looking forward to Thomas's return, but his late-night hours had become so frequent that she had learned not to expect him until well after midnight. She didn't mind so much. It gave her time to settle into her thoughts, to get comfortable in the quiet. She just hoped that things would feel normal again soon. She had no idea that tonight things would change. The covers were pulled off her body so suddenly, so violently, that she woke up with a jolt. She gasped, her eyes snapping open, heart racing. The sensation of the cold air on her skin sent a wave of shock through her body, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She sat up in bed, her hands trembling as she clutched at the sheets, pulling them up to her chest. The room was dark, except for the pale moonlight, which now seemed to be creeping across the floor in strange patterns. She glanced around, her breath caught in her throat. Nothing. Her pulse was racing, and her mind spun with confusion. She had felt it, the covers being yanked off her, as though someone had been standing right beside the bed. But there was no one. The room was empty. The silence was deafening, thick with the weight of an unspoken presence. She stared at the empty space next to her, where Thomas usually slept. He still wasn't home. Her phone lay on the nightstand, silent, and she reached for it, feeling the familiar weight of it in her hand as she unlocked the screen. No messages, no missed calls. He hadn't returned yet. The time was well past midnight. He wouldn't be home for another hour or so. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe she had shifted in her sleep and the covers had simply fallen off, though it felt too real, too tangible. There had been a pull, a force, something that had made her flinch awake. But no, that wasn't possible. It couldn't have been just a dream. She was wide awake now, and the sensation was still fresh in her mind. She let out a shaky breath, trying to calm herself, but the fear wouldn't subside. A strange, uncomfortable thought crept into her mind, one she had been trying to ignore for days now. What if something is wrong? What if it's not just my imagination? She slid out of bed, the cool wooden floor beneath her feet sending a shiver up her spine. The air in the room felt different, colder, though the thermostat was set to a comfortable temperature. Her skin prickled with unease. She glanced around the room again, searching the shadows, but there was nothing, only the quiet, oppressive stillness of the night. It's nothing, she thought, pushing the thought away. Just a bad dream. Just the silence getting to me. But as she stood there, rooted to the spot, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was the same feeling she had had before, the one that crept up on her in the quiet moments of the day, the one that made her glance over her shoulder in an empty room, the one that made her heart race for no reason at all. She looked toward the door, hoping to hear the familiar sound of Thomas's footsteps, but the hallway outside the bedroom was empty. The house was still. Her mind raced as she stood there, her thoughts spinning in a frantic circle. Should I call him? She wondered, but she quickly discarded the idea. There was no point. He was probably stuck at the office again, his phone turned off, lost in his work. He would be home when he was home. Her eyes flicked back to the bed, and for a moment she hesitated. But something drew her back. Something made her want to get back under the covers, to hide from the chilling sensation that seemed to linger in the room. She climbed back into bed, pulling the covers tightly around her. She tried to calm her breathing, closing her eyes and focusing on the rhythmic sound of her own heartbeat, the steady pulse that should have comforted her but now seemed to echo too loudly in the silence. She told herself it was nothing. She was just tired, just imagining things. The house was old, it creaked, it settled. She had read all about it when they first moved in. It was part of the charm, part of what made it special. But as she drifted back into sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone in the room. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy tension that Sarah couldn't shake. Every sound, every small movement seemed to carry an extra layer of significance. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, silent, cold, and watchful. She had always been a practical person, and yet she couldn't deny the sense of foreboding that seemed to settle deeper into her chest each day. Thomas returned late again that night, but when he came through the door, Sarah didn't mention what had happened. She couldn't bring herself to tell him about the strange sensation, the pull of the covers, or the whispers that still lingered in the back of her mind. He would have dismissed it. She was sure of it. He was too busy to even notice. They had dinner in silence. The conversation strained, and when they went to bed, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the night before, the way the covers had been torn off her, and the heavy, suffocating silence that followed. But sleep, when it finally came, was no refuge. That night, Sarah dreamed, no, saw something in the shadows. In the dream, she was standing in the hallway, the lights flickering above her. She turned, hearing a soft footstep behind her, and as she looked over her shoulder, she saw the silhouette of a person standing in the doorway of the bedroom. The figure was tall and thin, almost skeletal, its features obscured by the shadows. Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine as the figure reached out a hand toward her, a long, pale hand that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The dream ended before she could move, before she could scream. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest, and the room was still as quiet as it had always been. But now something was different. The house, the air. It felt thicker, heavier, like it was alive, like it was breathing with her. Sarah lay still for a moment, her body frozen in fear, and then slowly she turned her head toward the bedroom door. It was closed, the dark wood gleaming in the faint light of the moon. No, she thought, her pulse quickening. It's just a dream. It's just... But deep down, she knew it wasn't. She wasn't just imagining things. There was something in the house, something that had been waiting, watching since they moved in. And it was getting closer. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's anxiety deepened. The pull of the covers, the whispers, the strange, fleeting shadows, each event seemed to compound the sense of dread she couldn't escape. She couldn't tell anyone, couldn't explain it, not even to Thomas. He was too caught up in his work, and the fear that twisted in her gut only grew stronger with each passing day. The feeling of being watched was ever present now, and the house seemed to grow more oppressive, more suffocating. Every step she took, every breath she drew, felt like a step deeper into the unknown, into something dark and ancient that she could neither comprehend nor escape. And still, no answers came. In the dead of night, when Sarah woke again, she could swear she heard something moving in the house, something following her, something was waiting. The days had become a blur of silence and anxiety. Sarah woke to the same stillness every morning, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on her chest, the loneliness closing in like a thick fog. Thomas's absence only deepened the sense of isolation. When he left for work in the mornings, it was as if the house sighed with relief, settling into its familiar, oppressive quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, and the soft, almost imperceptible creaking of the floorboards were the only sounds that kept her company. But it wasn't enough. The house felt empty in a way that was different from loneliness. It was an emptiness that seemed to come from within the walls themselves, as if the house itself was hollow, waiting for something to fill it, something dark and ancient. Each day, Sarah moved about the house mechanically, completing the small tasks that seemed to fill her time. She tried to find comfort in the routines, in the acts of organizing, cleaning, and waiting. But every sound she heard, every shadow that flickered at the edge of her vision, made her jump. The house felt like it was closing in on her, the walls themselves seeming to breathe, shift, and groan with a strange, unsettling energy. It started with the creaks, small and unremarkable at first. Just the house settling, she thought. She had read about how old houses like theirs made sounds at night, how the wood expanded and contracted with the change in temperature. The whispers in the hallway, the shuffling noises that seemed to come from nowhere. She told herself it was all part of the natural rhythm of the place. But the sounds grew. They weren't just creaks anymore. At first it was faint, like the sound of something tapping against the walls. It was so soft, she thought it was her imagination. Until it came again. Tap, tap, tap. 3 distinct knocks, as if someone was gently tapping on the wall behind her. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there. The walls were still, as silent as they had been for years. Sarah stood frozen, her breath shallow, her mind trying to reason with the panic that gripped her chest. It's nothing, she told herself, just a random sound, probably from the pipes or the house settling. But as the days passed, the tapping grew louder, more distinct. And then came the scratching. It was subtle at first, just a faint sound that could easily be ignored, but soon it became an insistent scraping, like something or someone was trying to claw its way through the walls. This isn't normal, Sarah thought, her heart pounding in her chest as the scratching continued. She looked at the walls, her eyes darting across the room, as if expecting to see the source of the noise emerge from the plaster. She stood there, paralyzed, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. The silence was deafening, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. For a long moment, Sarah stood there, her mind racing with questions, none of which she had the answers to. She could feel the walls closing in, pressing down on her. There was something in this house, something old, something that wasn't going to let her be at peace. The next morning, the anxiety gnawed at her relentlessly. She tried to distract herself by going through the boxes in the spare room, hoping that the routine of unpacking would keep her mind occupied. But even then, the silence was oppressive. She kept hearing noises that made her pause, sounds from the ceiling, from the walls, from somewhere just out of her reach. Each time she tried to dismiss them, they grew louder, more frequent, more insistent. She knew she couldn't keep ignoring it. The tapping, the scratching. It was becoming too much. She had to understand what was happening. She had to know if she was losing her mind or if something truly was wrong with the house. So, that afternoon, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't rely on her husband, who was so consumed with work that he hadn't noticed the changes in her behavior. She couldn't ask her friends because she knew they would dismiss her worries as nothing more than the paranoia of a lonely pregnant woman. But maybe there was something in the history of the house that could explain the strange noises, the sense of being watched, the weight of the silence. She pulled out her laptop and began researching. She typed the name of the street into the search bar, then the address of the house, hoping to find some record of its history. It wasn't much. A few real estate listings, some old newspaper articles mentioning the property as historic or well-preserved. But nothing that could explain the feeling of dread that seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. She dug deeper, her fingers flying over the keys as she explored obscure archives and forums, hoping to find something, anything, that could make sense of the strange occurrences. But all she found were mentions of the house's age, its original owners, and a few vague comments about its charming old-world character. There was nothing that pointed to any kind of history that could explain what she was experiencing. Frustrated, she leaned back in her chair, running her hands through her hair. This wasn't helping. She felt like she was chasing shadows, reaching for something that was just out of her grasp. The tapping continued, louder now, as if the walls themselves were beginning to echo with the sounds. It was as though something was moving through the house, something that had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface. Her thoughts turned to the walls again. The sound seemed to come from within them, as though the very structure of the house was alive, shifting, moving in response to her presence. What if the house was trying to tell her something? What if it was trying to reach out to her, to communicate in a language she couldn't understand? She had to find out. Later that evening, she made her way to the attic. It was the only place in the house she hadn't explored fully. The small, cramped space had been used for storage before they moved in, and it was filled with old boxes, old furniture, and dust. As she climbed the narrow staircase, she felt the familiar unease settle into her stomach. The air in the attic was thick, stagnant, and the smell of old wood and dust clung to her skin. She turned on the light and scanned the room. The walls were lined with old trunks and boxes, but there was nothing that seemed out of place. No hidden passages, no evidence of something lurking behind the walls. Still, the feeling of being watched was stronger here than anywhere else in the house. She could feel the eyes of the house on her, even though she was alone. She approached one of the walls, pressing her ear to it, hoping to hear something, anything, that would explain the sounds. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the house, the sound of her own breathing. Her fingers traced the grain of the wood, and she felt a strange chill run through her. There was something off about this wall, something she couldn't explain. With trembling hands, she pulled out a small flashlight and shone it along the edge of the wall, looking for any signs of damage or a hidden passage. Her eyes scanned every inch of the surface, searching for something, anything, that might tell her what was happening. And then she saw it. At the far corner of the wall, the wood seemed to be moving. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift, a minuscule movement that she might have missed if she hadn't been staring so intently. But as she watched, it shifted again, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though something behind the wall was trying to make its presence known. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, heart racing. What was behind this wall? Was it just a trick of the light, or was there something more? She placed her hand on the wall, feeling the vibrations beneath her fingertips, and for the first time since moving in, she felt something truly terrifying. A pulse of something alive. Her hand jerked away and she took a step back, her mind reeling. She couldn't breathe. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with something she couldn't name. The silence was unbearable now, broken only by the frantic beating of her heart. The day had bled into twilight, the light outside fading into a soft golden hue that bathed the house in an eerie calm. Sarah stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing her long, tangled hair. The reflection staring back at her seemed distant, as though it wasn't quite her own, the shadows beneath her eyes darker than usual, the faintest tremble in her hands. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant ticking of the clock in the living room. It was one of those rare moments when she could almost forget the strange happenings, until something in the mirror caught her eye. At first, it was barely perceptible, a subtle shift in the reflection, like a dark smudge moving just out of her sight. She paused, her brush mid-stroke, watching closely. The figure in the mirror seemed to shift. Its outline was indistinct yet unmistakable, a dark shape, tall and thin, standing behind her. The air in the room felt charged with something she couldn't identify. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, and her heartbeat quickened. She turned quickly, whipping her body around, but there was no one there. The bathroom was empty. Her breath came in shallow gasps, a sense of cold panic creeping up her spine. She stared into the mirror, almost afraid to look again, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The reflection remained still, just her own face staring back at her now, no shadow, no figure. She blinked, trying to force her pulse to slow, but the feeling didn't leave her. It lingered like a presence, an invisible weight that pressed against her chest. Her mind raced. Had she seen something? Was it just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the dimming day outside? Or was there more to it? She wasn't sure what frightened her more, the possibility of her own mind playing tricks on her, or the thought that something, or someone, was in the house with her just beyond her reach. Sarah shook her head, trying to dismiss the image. It was nothing, she told herself, nothing at all. She turned back to the mirror, forcing herself to meet her own gaze. But even as she did, her thoughts were consumed with the figure that had seemed to hover just behind her. It wasn't the first time she'd felt like something was watching her, lurking in the corners of her vision. But this time it was different. She was losing control. She had to tell herself that. She had to make herself believe that it was all in her mind, that the whispering, the creaks in the walls, the shadows flitting just beyond her sight, none of it was real. It was just the isolation, the pregnancy, the long, empty days. Stress, anxiety. These things could make a person see things. But the longer she stayed in the house, the harder it became to convince herself that she wasn't losing her grip on reality. The nights were the worst. The quiet of the house at night was unbearable. As soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the silence seemed to grow deeper, more oppressive. It felt as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. And every night, as Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting too, watching her. One night, she awoke with a start, her heart pounding. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, thick with a coldness that crept into her bones. She sat up, looking around the room, trying to make sense of the sensation that gripped her. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive. She could hear faint whispers like a conversation just out of her hearing, but there was no one in the room. She stood, trembling, her body moving instinctively toward the source of the sound. The footsteps were next. They were faint at first, like the soft tap of shoes on wood, the kind of noise you might expect from someone walking down a hallway just outside the room. But as she stood, listening, they grew louder, closer. Her heart raced. She reached for the door, but just as her fingers touched the handle, the sound stopped. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The house was silent again, dead silent. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the quiet before a storm. She didn't dare open the door. Instead, she stayed in her room, the covers pulled tightly around her, her eyes wide in the dark. The whispers and footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched, of being observed, never left her. It lingered in the corners of her mind, in the back of her thoughts, pressing against her consciousness. When morning came, the sun broke through the blinds in slanted golden beams. It should have been a relief, but Sarah felt no better. She had hoped that sleep would offer some respite, that the darkness would stay behind her, but it had followed her into the daylight. Days began to blur together. She found herself wandering through the house aimlessly, a sense of disorientation creeping up on her like a slow tide. She had always been a creature of habit, someone who took comfort in routine. But now, routine felt like a trap, an endless loop of waiting for something to happen but never knowing when it would come. The isolation made everything worse, the walls closing in, the whispers growing louder. She began to notice more details, the soft creak of the floorboards as she walked through the hallways, the way the air felt colder in certain rooms, the way the shadows seemed to shift in the corner of her vision. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive. Not in the way a person might be alive, but in the way something old and ancient could be, something that had been waiting for a long time. It wasn't just the house either. The dreams. The dreams were becoming more frequent, more vivid, and more disturbing. The dreams were always the same. She was standing in the hallway of the house, but it was darker somehow, the walls stretching and shifting in unnatural ways. And then the figure would appear. It was always there, just at the edge of her vision, a dark shape moving through the hallway, watching her. She couldn't make out its features, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold and unblinking. The whispers would grow louder in the dream, filling her head with unintelligible murmurs, until the figure was almost upon her, and she would wake, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. The dreams felt real, more real than waking life. They left her feeling exhausted, drained, like a part of her had been taken during the night. She couldn't tell what was real anymore, whether the whispers and shadows were part of the house, or whether they had followed her into her dreams. It was as if the line between sleep and reality was beginning to blur. She was losing herself, piece by piece. One evening, while walking through the living room, Sarah passed the mirror again. She had stopped looking into it as often, afraid of what she might see. But as she caught a glimpse of herself, something stopped her. The reflection seemed different somehow. The shadows beneath her eyes were darker than before, the weariness in her face more pronounced. But there was something else, something strange. In the reflection, her gaze flickered. For a brief moment, she thought she saw it. Again. The figure. It was just behind her, standing in the reflection, its features distorted but its presence unmistakable. And just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. She turned around, but as before, there was no one there, just the empty, silent house. But this time, the silence felt heavier. It felt more deliberate. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape them. The house was alive, and it was waiting for her. The house was eerily quiet, just as it had been every night since they had moved in. But tonight, something was different. A sense of unease hung in the air like a heavy fog. The protagonist tossed and turned in the bed, her body restless and filled with a quiet anxiety that she couldn't shake. The days were beginning to bleed into each other, and the solitude that had once been a comfort was now her greatest torment. She had grown used to the silence of the house, the way the floorboards creaked underfoot, the way the air seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy. But tonight, it felt as though something more was waiting just beyond her reach. Her eyes fluttered open, the darkness of the room pressing in on her from every angle. The faint glow of the streetlights outside filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows on the walls. Her husband had been away for several days, working on a project that kept him tied up in the city, and she was left alone with nothing but the hum of the house to keep her company. But tonight, the house felt alive in a way it hadn't before. She heard a faint sound, almost imperceptible at first, like a whisper brushing against her ear. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound came again, louder this time, just a breath, like someone sighing softly in the dark. Her pulse quickened. She strained to hear, trying to convince herself that it was just the house settling, the wind against the windows. But there was something unsettling about the sound, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She shifted, propping herself up on one elbow. Her eyes scanned the room, but all she could see was the dark outline of the furniture and the flickering shadows that danced on the walls. The whispering sound seemed to echo in her ears, growing stronger and more distinct. "Help me," the voice whispered, a soft, haunting plea. She gasped, her heart hammering in her chest. Her breath hitched as she tried to steady herself, but fear had already taken root deep within her. She wasn't alone. The presence was there, hovering just out of sight, and it was watching her. The walls of the house creaked as though they too were breathing. The air became thick and heavy, a suffocating weight that pressed down on her chest. The sense of being surrounded, trapped, was unbearable. The room, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt like a cage. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, soft but deliberate. She turned her head sharply, expecting to see her husband standing in the doorway. But the room was empty. There was nothing there but the oppressive darkness. She reached for the light switch, but her fingers trembled as they brushed against the cold wall. The shadows seemed to grow, stretching out like fingers reaching for her. She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat, trapped by an invisible force that rendered her mute. Her eyes darted to the window. The blinds were drawn, and yet she felt a sudden shift in the air, as if something had moved just beyond her sight. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, louder than the whispers now, as she strained to hear anything beyond the silence. But there was nothing. Suddenly, the soft sound of a door creaking open broke the stillness. She froze again, her body rigid with fear. The door to the guest room, the one at the end of the hallway, had been closed earlier that night. She distinctly remembered shutting it before going to bed. But now, it was open. Her pulse quickened, and she could feel the cold sweat begin to form on her forehead. The room, which had once been a place of peace, now felt like a trap. The air was thick with an ominous presence, something she couldn't fully grasp, but something she felt with every inch of her being. The whispering came again, louder this time, as if it was right next to her ear. "Don't go," the voice urged. the tone desperate yet hauntingly calm. She couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, filled with conflicting thoughts. Was she imagining this? Was the stress of being alone for so long starting to take its toll? Or was there something truly sinister at work here? She couldn't tell. All she knew was that the presence in the house had grown stronger, more insistent, and it was no longer something she could ignore. The footsteps in the hallway grew closer. She could hear them clearly now, slow and deliberate. They were unmistakable. Someone, or something, was moving just outside her room. Her body stiffened, her hand clenching the blanket tightly as she tried to summon the courage to call out, to confront whatever it was. But her voice failed her, trapped in the pit of her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The whispers intensified, and she could feel her mind unraveling. The weight of the house pressed down on her, the walls seemed to close in, and the vibrations in the air were now almost unbearable. Her whole body was shaking, and her breath came in short, panicked gasps. "Help me," the voice whispered again, but this time it sounded different. There was an edge to it, a sense of urgency and fear that chilled her to the bone. The sound of footsteps stopped suddenly. Silence descended like a thick, suffocating fog. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment all she could do was stare at the open door, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. And then, in the stillness, she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on the wall. It came from the other side of the room, close to the window. It was slow at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more frantic, until it felt as if the house itself was screaming in silent agony. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the noise, but it only grew louder. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange, dark energy. A deep vibration shook the air, and for a moment she thought the entire house might collapse under the weight of whatever force was pressing against it. The air turned cold, biting against her skin as though a gust of icy wind had swept through the room. Her breath came in shallow, erratic gasps, and her body trembled uncontrollably. She opened her eyes, and there, standing at the foot of the bed, was a figure. It was tall and shadowy, its form flickering in and out of existence like a mirage. The figure had no distinct features, just a shifting silhouette that seemed to bend and twist in the darkness. Her blood ran cold as she stared at the figure, her mind screaming at her to move, to run, to do anything to escape, but her body refused to obey. She was paralyzed with fear, rooted to the bed, unable to look away. The whispers came again, louder this time, but this time they weren't just words. They were a command, a warning. "Leave now." The voice was no longer faint. It was clear and unmistakable, as if it were coming from the very walls themselves, from the very foundation of the house. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The figure in the room began to move, its form flickering with each step. Slowly, deliberately, it moved closer, and she could feel the weight of its presence bearing down on her, like a dark cloud that had descended upon her soul. In that moment she realized the truth. The house was alive, and it was trying to speak to her, to warn her, to keep her trapped within its walls. The figure was almost at her side now, and the air grew colder still. Her breath was a shallow, frantic gasp, and her body shook uncontrollably. But before she could react, everything stopped. The figure vanished. The whispers ceased. The cold air was replaced by an unnatural silence, one that pressed against her chest like a heavy weight. The house was still again, but the fear remained. The night had passed in a haze of exhaustion, the terror of the night before still fresh in her mind. Her heart, though somewhat calmed by the light of day, still raced at odd moments, and every creak of the house felt like a warning, a reminder of the terror lurking just beneath the surface. It had been weeks since she first began to feel the weight of the house's presence pressing in on her. Weeks since she'd started hearing the whispers, feeling the cold breath of something unknown brushing against her skin, seeing the flickers of movement in the corner of her eyes. The incidents, each seemingly more chilling than the last, had left her feeling helpless, and every attempt to explain them away felt more like a betrayal of the truth. Determined to find answers, she had spent hours each day going through the old newspapers, digging through public records, hoping to find some clue that would explain what was happening. She had seen enough to know that there was something wrong with the house, something that had been there long before they arrived. And it was this something that had haunted her since the first day they moved in, something that had woven itself into the fabric of the house like an insidious thread. Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through the brittle pages of an old archive. She could almost hear the house's silence pressing in on her, as if the walls themselves were waiting for her to uncover the secret they had hidden for so long. It was then, amid the dusty files and forgotten names, that she found it. A name. A date. The house had once belonged to a family, a husband, wife, and their 2 young children. The tragic event had occurred 15 years ago, but there was little in the way of concrete details. The initial police reports had labelled it as an unfortunate suicide. The wife had died in the house, though the circumstances surrounding her death were unclear. Some said she had taken her own life, unable to cope with the isolation of the house. Others whispered that it was something darker, that she had been pushed to her death by a force beyond her control. Theories swirled, but no one ever spoke the truth. But there was more. In one of the deeper corners of the archive, a name caught her attention: Eleanor Mallory. The name belonged to the former owner of the house, the woman who had lived there and died so suddenly. She had lived alone for years before her death, a widow with no family nearby. Local gossip claimed that Eleanor had been a troubled soul, her life marked by strange events and unexplainable occurrences. Some even spoke of her practicing occult rituals, though these were just rumors. The story of her life and her tragic end had been buried beneath years of dust and half-forgotten whispers. As the hours passed, she pored over everything she could find about Eleanor Mallory and the house she had once lived in. The more she read, the more she realized that the woman's death had been no simple tragedy. There were conflicting accounts, mysterious references to events that didn't add up, and the feeling that something had been covered up. She felt a strange connection to Eleanor, as if she were following in the same path, her mind slowly unraveling, just as the woman's had. She couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's spirit had never left the house, that it had lingered, tied to the walls, the floors, the very air they breathed. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was this restless spirit that was haunting her now. It was late afternoon when her husband returned home, his presence a brief respite from the chaos of her thoughts. He stepped into the room, smiling, tired from his long day at work. He kissed her forehead, his touch warm against her cool skin. But there was a certain distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "How was your day?" he asked casually, as though nothing had changed. She could tell he didn't understand. He never understood. "I found something," she said quietly, her voice a mere whisper. "Something about the house." He raised an eyebrow, the smile on his lips faltering slightly. "What do you mean? What did you find?" "I went through some old records. I found the history of the house," she said, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. She needed him to understand, to see what she had uncovered. "There's a tragedy in its past. A woman, Eleanor Mallory. She died here, but the circumstances are strange. It wasn't just a suicide. There's something more to it. I think the house is haunted." Her husband's face softened with what appeared to be concern, but it quickly morphed into something else, something dismissive. "Honey, I think you're just stressing out. It's probably just the pregnancy hormones getting to you. You've been through a lot lately. The stress is getting to you." She recoiled at his words. She had expected it, but hearing it still stung. The same dismissive tone, The same words she had heard countless times. It was always the same. Pregnancy, stress, paranoia. But it wasn't just that. She knew it wasn't. "It's not just that," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm telling you, there's something wrong with this place. I can feel it." He stepped closer, reaching out to touch her arm. His fingers were gentle, but the look in his eyes was one she had seen before, when he didn't believe her, when he thought she was losing her grip on reality. "We'll get through this, okay? But you need to relax. This house, it's just old. You're imagining things." She wanted to scream at him, to tell him how wrong he was. She wanted to make him see, make him understand. But she couldn't. She didn't have the words, not anymore. Her frustration and fear were trapped within her, tangled in a web of doubt and isolation. She was alone, even when he was beside her. Alone in a house that wasn't just old, it was cursed. The days seemed to stretch endlessly, each one blurring into the next. The sun rose, casting weak light into the corners of the house, and set, leaving the darkness to creep over every surface, over every moment. It was in the quiet of the night, however, that the house truly came alive. The strange phenomena, the whispers, the cold drafts, had all begun to intensify, and there was no escape from them, no moment of peace, no relief. She had tried so hard to ignore the mounting terror she felt every time she entered a room, every time she turned a corner. But as the days wore on, the unease settled deeper into her bones, until it was no longer something she could push aside. It was a part of her now, an uninvited shadow that followed her everywhere. The first time she noticed the movement was subtle. A glass on the kitchen counter, a vase by the window, a picture frame on the mantel. Nothing too dramatic, just the tiniest of shifts. At first she told herself it was nothing, just the vibrations of the old house, the natural settling of the wood and plaster. But then it started happening more frequently, and with less explanation. She could no longer deny it. One afternoon, while she was sitting in the living room, she saw the window pane tremble. She froze. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. She watched, her heart pounding in her chest, as the window slowly creaked open by itself. Her breath caught in her throat. She rushed to close it, but before her fingers could touch the frame, it slammed shut again, as if someone, or something, had decided it was done with her interference. A chill passed over her skin as the room grew colder. She glanced around, her pulse quickening, but there was no one there. Her husband was still at work, as he had been for the past few days, leaving her alone in the house, alone with the dark presence that had settled like a weight in every corner. And then there were the whispers. At first they were soft, fleeting, as though carried on the wind. She heard them most when she was alone, late at night or early in the morning when the house was quiet and still. But they had grown louder, clearer. Sometimes they sounded like words, a language she couldn't quite understand. Other times, they were just an indistinct murmur, too low to make sense of, but undeniably there, hovering in the air around her. One night, after an evening of restless pacing through the house, she found herself standing in the hallway, her hand pressed to the cold walls, her breathing shallow. The whisper seemed to be coming from the kitchen. She stood frozen, unable to move, as the sound grew louder, beckoning her, drawing her closer. She wanted to scream, to call out for help, but she couldn't. Her body was frozen, as if bound by an unseen force. Her fingers trembled as she moved down the hall, each step feeling like an eternity. The house felt alive in a way she could not explain. Something pulsing beneath the surface, something dark that was reaching out to her. When she reached the kitchen, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Her skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, of being surrounded by unseen eyes. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest, only to find the kitchen window wide open, the curtain billowing in the breeze that wasn't there before. She hadn't opened it. She knew that. The door to the pantry was ajar, its hinges creaking as though someone had just passed through. She stepped forward, hesitant, as the floor creaked beneath her feet. And then, without warning, the refrigerator door swung open, the light inside flickering on and off in a frantic rhythm. It was as if something inside the house was trying to tell her something, trying to communicate with her in a language she couldn't understand. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the kitchen floor, her hands gripping the tiles for support. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the whispering began again, this time louder, more insistent. The voice was clearer now, unmistakable. It was calling her name. She didn't know how long she sat there, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes wide with terror. She wanted to run, to escape, but she knew she couldn't. There was no place left to go. The house had become a prison, and she was trapped within it. No matter where she went, the presence followed. No matter how hard she tried to escape, it was always there, lurking just beyond her reach. Days turned into weeks, and the house grew colder. The whispers grew louder. The objects in the house moved more frequently. She no longer had any control over the space she inhabited. Every time she tried to retreat to her bedroom, to find solace in the one place that was supposed to be hers, the walls seemed to close in around her. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wood, seemed like an ominous reminder of the thing that was waiting for her to crack, waiting for her to break. Her husband, once so present and comforting, had become more distant than ever. She could see it in his eyes, the way he avoided her gaze, the way his voice held a coldness that hadn't been there before. He had always dismissed her fears, telling her that it was just the stress, that it was just the pregnancy. But now, his dismissals had become sharper, more impatient. He didn't believe her, and perhaps that was the hardest part. Her isolation was no longer just a physical distance between them. It was an emotional one too. He no longer saw her, no longer heard her. He was blind to what was happening, and it was killing her inside. The house was becoming her only companion, her only confidant, and even it seemed to turn against her. One night, she tried to talk to him again, desperate for him to understand. But when she tried to tell him about the strange noises, the movement of objects, the feeling of being watched, his face hardened. He was tired of hearing it. "You're imagining things," he said, his voice flat, his back turned as he moved towards the kitchen. "This isn't real. It's just your mind playing tricks." Her heart twisted in her chest. She knew it wasn't her mind. She knew it wasn't just hormones. But how could she make him understand? How could she make anyone understand when she herself didn't know the truth? That night she lay in bed, the room suffocatingly silent. The darkness pressed in on her, and the house seemed to close around her like a vice. The whispering started again, but this time it was different. This time it was louder, closer, as though it was right next to her, hovering in the air just above her ear. "Follow me," the voice whispered. A shiver ran down her spine. She wanted to scream, she wanted to run, but her body felt paralyzed, frozen in place. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was an invitation, a command, and somehow she knew in the depths of her soul that she had to follow it. The isolation had become unbearable. The house had become a cage, and she was the trapped animal. There was no escape from it, no way out. She had no choice but to listen. The attic had always been a place she had avoided. The narrow stairs, creaking underfoot, led up to a space that felt both oppressive and mysterious. The dim light from the small, dust-covered window barely illuminated the forgotten relics of the past. Old trunks, cardboard boxes filled with things that no one had bothered to look at for years. It was a place of neglect, untouched by time. yet it seemed to hold within it the weight of every forgotten story, every unspoken secret of the house. But today, something was different. The air felt colder as she ascended the steps, the familiar hum of the house now replaced by a stillness so thick it pressed against her chest. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to find something. Something that had been buried away for too long. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, broken mirrors, and yellowing newspapers. Her footsteps echoed through the silence as she moved deeper into the room. It was the smell that hit her first, the musty odor of old paper mixed with something else she couldn't quite place. A scent that seemed to twist in her throat, thick and unsettling. And then she saw it. A small wooden box, tucked away in the farthest corner of the attic, hidden behind a stack of forgotten crates. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, the dust coating the surface thick like a veil. She wiped it away, revealing an ornate lock, tarnished with age. The box was surprisingly light for its size, and as she held it in her hands, a strange sense of anticipation filled her. She hesitated for a moment. There had been too many signs already, too many strange occurrences, but this felt different. She felt drawn to it, as though something was calling her, urging her to open it. Her heart raced in her chest as she flipped the latch open. Inside the box, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was an old leather-bound diary. The cover was cracked, its edges worn and faded, but there was something undeniably familiar about it. The weight of the moment pressed down on her as she slowly opened the first page, the sound of the paper crinkling in the quiet attic filling her ears. The writing was spidery and uneven but legible. The words seemed to leap off the page, as though they were alive, pulsating with an energy she could almost feel. As she read, her breath caught in her throat. I've become aware of it now. It follows me everywhere. The whispers in the dark, the soft footsteps behind me at night. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but it's real. It's here, with me, all the time. I can't escape it. And yet, it's not really here. It's invisible, a presence. I don't know how to describe it. Her hands shook as she turned the page, the ink on the next lines running in strange, looping patterns. The words were frantic, like someone who had written in desperation, trying to make sense of an unraveling mind. I'm beginning to fear it. I think it wants something from me. It speaks to me when I'm alone, and it moves closer each night. I can feel it watching me, standing just out of sight, waiting. It whispers my name, but not in words. It speaks in feelings, in images. I can't tell if it's real or just my mind playing tricks, but I know it's there. It's never far away. The diary was filled with entries like this, disjointed, paranoid, and tinged with madness. But as she read, the fear she felt began to shift, to change. This wasn't just some random rambling of a troubled mind. This was real, the feelings she had experienced, her own encounters with the invisible force, the whispers, the sensations of being watched, all matched perfectly with what was written in this diary. She continued to read, unable to tear herself away from the pages as though they held the answers she so desperately sought. It wants me to follow it, to listen to its voice. But every time I do, something changes. The darkness grows thicker, and the whispers become louder, more demanding. I can't escape it, and it's beginning to feel like I'm losing myself in it, like I'm becoming part of it. I don't know how to stop it anymore. The last entry was short, written in hurried scrawl. I can hear it now. It's in the walls. It's close. It's coming for me. The diary fell from her hands, slipping to the floor with a hollow thud that seemed to reverberate through the entire attic. She sat there, frozen, her mind racing, her breath shallow. The room around her spun as the words echoed in her head. It was real. The invisible presence that had been haunting her for weeks, the strange happenings, the whispers in the dark. It was all connected to this house. But what was it? What was the entity that had tormented the previous occupant and now seemed to have turned its attention to her? The more she thought about it, the more she realized how much the lines between reality and madness were blurring. Was she losing her mind, or was there something truly sinister at play here? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. The journal's final entry lingered in her mind. I can hear it now. It's in the walls. She looked up at the attic's low ceiling, the shadows shifting in the dim light. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt that all too familiar sensation, the feeling of being watched. The house was alive, breathing with a presence that was just out of reach, and she had no idea what it wanted. She had thought she understood the house, its creaks, its groans, its whispers. But now, after reading those words, she knew there was something more, something far darker, something invisible and yet undeniable, reaching out to her through the fabric of this house, wrapping itself around her like a cold, suffocating fog. A sudden noise made her freeze, a creak in the floorboards. She whipped her head around, but there was nothing there. Just the silence, thick and unnerving. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, the air colder. The house had been hiding its secrets for so long, and now it was revealing them to her, piece by piece. But what could she do with this knowledge? How could she fight an enemy that was invisible, intangible, that didn't follow the rules of the world she knew? The walls seemed to breathe with her, and for the first time, she wondered if the house itself was alive. The storm raged outside, battering the house with waves of wind and sheets of rain. The windows rattled with each gust, and the trees outside bent under the violent force of the tempest. Inside, the house seemed to groan in response, its old bones creaking and shifting as though it were alive, moving with the storm's fury. It was the perfect backdrop for the dark revelation that had been creeping toward her for weeks. She stood by the window, watching the lightning flash across the sky, illuminating the desolate landscape. The flickering light made shadows dance along the walls, but it wasn't the storm that had her attention. It was him, her husband. He had come home after days of being gone, but something was different. She hadn't been able to place it at first, but now, standing in the dim light of the living room, she could see it clearly. His eyes were distant, clouded, as if he wasn't entirely there. There was something about his movements, the way he moved through the house, as though he were following the rhythm of a different pulse, one that wasn't his own. He hadn't spoken much since his return. At first he had tried to reassure her, to tell her that it was all in her head, that the house was simply playing tricks on her, that the pregnancy was making her paranoid. But she could see it now. She could feel it in the way he no longer seemed to see her. How his eyes flitted past her as though she were a shadow, just another part of the house he no longer noticed. The presence was getting to him too. Slowly, subtly. It had found him, just as it had found her. As she turned from the window, she saw him standing at the door of the kitchen, staring out into the dark hall. His back was to her, but she could feel his tension, like the taut string of a bow ready to snap. He hadn't spoken a word to her since his arrival, and it wasn't just because of his exhaustion. Something was wrong. Something inside of him was breaking apart. Her thoughts were interrupted by the crack of thunder, loud and deafening, making the house tremble. The lights flickered, dimming for a heartbeat before coming back on. But when they did, the temperature in the room had dropped. A chill ran down her spine, and she glanced around the room. The whispers had returned, faint but persistent, like a chorus in the corners of her mind. She felt the weight of the house pressing in on her, its walls closing in tighter, suffocating her. Her hands shook, her pulse quickened. She had always felt the house watching her, listening to her, But now it felt like it was closing in around them both. It had a hunger, an insatiable need, and it was feeding on their fear, on their isolation. Her husband's voice broke the silence, low and hoarse. "It's not real, you know." He didn't turn to face her. "None of it is. It's just in your head." She tried to steady her breath. No, it's not. It's here. With us. It's in the walls, in the floors. It's in you." Her voice cracked, but she couldn't hold it back. "I don't know what it is, but it's real, and it's changing you." He turned slowly, his gaze now locking with hers. For a moment, his eyes seemed to flicker, like they were fighting to stay focused, to stay human. But then, just as quickly, the darkness overtook them again, leaving behind a hollow, empty look. "You don't understand," he said, his voice distant. "It's not what you think. It doesn't want what you think it wants." The words hit her like a physical blow, and her stomach twisted in fear. She could feel it then, like the house itself was alive, suffocating them both with its presence. The walls seemed to press in closer, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent, more urgent. The storm outside intensified, and the wind howled as though it, too, was part of the torment. "I can't fight it anymore," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm's roar. "I won't." Her heart clenched in her chest. "What do you mean?" The answer came in a low growl, barely a breath. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. We're already part of it. I've already made my choice." The words hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the truth. The presence, it, had already claimed him. It had twisted him, broken him down, and now she could feel the pull, the darkness that was calling to her, just as it had called to him. "No!" she shouted, the terror rising in her chest, threatening to choke her. You're not yourself! This house, it's poisoning you!" He took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The air around them grew heavier, thick with tension. The house seemed to hum with energy, the walls vibrating, the whispers crawling under her skin. "It's too late," he said, his voice flat, detached. "You'll understand soon enough. We're both part of this now." The words cut through her like a knife, and she took a step back, a sob escaping her throat. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, its presence closing in. The storm outside intensified, and with each flash of lightning, the shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, more twisted. And then, as if on cue, the ground shook, and the lights flickered again, plunging them into darkness. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, swirling around her, drowning out everything else. She could feel something moving, something close. It was in the room with them. "It's time." Her breath caught in her throat. The presence was here. It was now. A voice broke the silence. "Come with me," it whispered, barely audible but unmistakable. Without thinking, her body moved on its own, drawn toward the voice, drawn to the promise of escape, or perhaps to the promise of something darker. She stepped forward, her feet barely touching the floor as she moved through the house. The walls seemed to breathe with her, their rhythm matching her pulse, her fear. The house was alive. But was it alive? Or had it been dead all along? As she reached the door to the cellar, the last place she hadn't dared to explore, the storm outside broke, and the house shook with a thunderous roar. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a chorus of voices screaming her name. Her hand reached for the doorknob, and then, for the first time since her arrival, she made a decision. She opened the door,